Welcome back. Even before he was released from house arrest, Hafiz Saeed was already planning his next move. While he was ostensibly shut out from the world, Saeed managed to move to the United Nations, no less, demanding the tag of terrorist be removed from his name. WION's Pakistan Bureau Chief Taha Siddiqui reports.
Hafiz Saeed is unfazed by warnings from India and the United States. The 26/11 Mumbai attack mastermind has moved the United Nations and wants the terrorist tag removed from his name.
From what we understand and what is being reported, this petition is particularly focusing on the fact that, Hafiz Saeed is labeled as a terrorist at the UN, and he wants that his name to be removed from it. I asked the lawyer if they had heard back from the United Nations, because the next step of this petition will be that they will be hearing from the United Nations whether or not this petition has been accepted or not. And he again refused to divulge any information. But what we know and understand right now is that the United Nations has not responded as of yet to this particular petition.
The Security Council had designated Saeed a terrorist just weeks after the Mumbai attacks. It also brought with it a set of sanctions. The designation placed an arms embargo, which aimed to prevent the direct and indirect supply of weapons. While announcing the sanctions, the United Nations Security Council also called on member nations to freeze Saeed's assets. The list of sanctions also included a ban on his travel. Despite the sanctions, the Pakistani establishment turned a blind eye to Saeed and his activities. His business of terrorism continued to flourish, and now, through the Milli Muslim League, Saeed wants to foray into Pakistan's mainstream politics.
We're already getting to know of information, and there is one retired former general of the military from the ISI who has said that there was a plan under the former military chief Rahil Sharif to mainstream these religious extremist groups, and this plan was being pushed by the government to sort of say that we need to de-radicalize these groups, and because of the international pressure, this is the way forward.
But the United Nations is unlikely to pay heed to terrorist Saeed. Most of the P5 members of the Security Council have vocally stood behind India against Pakistan on the issue of terrorism. Bureau Report, WION.
With us on the show, Ahmad Shaheen is a senior investigative journalist from Pakistan, works with Geo News among others. Rick C. Matthews from the Center for Counter-Terrorist Training with us from New York. Peter S. Henn, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Vermont, with us from Burlington. And Michael Kugelman, Senior Associate for South Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center from Washington. Good evening to all of you. Emma, to you first. Did you see this coming? Ahmad Shaheen, Hafiz Saeed has moved the United Nations demanding that the tag of terrorist be dropped from his name. Was this something on expected lines? Rick Matthews, if I could put that question to you, why does Hafiz Saeed suddenly care about being called a terrorist? Well, we seem to be having a difficult time with technology. Michael Kugelman, let me try my luck with the line with you. Did you expect Hafiz Saeed to be taking this move so shortly after his release from house arrest, which is still controversial, and the Americans are putting so much pressure on Pakistan to rearrest him?
Right. It actually is a very clever move, I think, on the part of Hafiz Saeed, because if he can get himself taken off this UN terror list, which quite frankly I think he will not, if he could get himself taken off the list, then he could simply say, oh, well, it's just an Indian and an American lie that I'm a terrorist. But of course, the fact that he's a UN designated terrorist, the UN has a lot of credibility and cachet around the world, including in Pakistan. And I think that the fact that right after the Mumbai terror attacks that, the UN essentially designated him as a terrorist, that really puts him in a much more difficult position. So it makes sense to me that he would want to get himself taken off the list, but I don't see any way that would happen. And I think that this will be one more attempt on his part to try to bring some legitimacy to him and his organization, which at the end of the day is a terrorist organization.
Peter Henn, if you can hear me, you've studied Pakistan closely as part of your research on how Muslim states' relationship with Islam affects their counter-terrorism policy. How do you see this entire Hafiz Saeed case, the way it's progressing? Is this a concerted effort on the part of the administration to clear his path to take a more prominent political role?
Well, it's certainly concerning, right, that he was put under house arrest finally after years of pressure and then released last week. And, as we saw with the protests that happened earlier, there's some sign of the military being supportive of these Islamists and not taking a hard enough stance against them. But we also see some divisions within Pakistan on this. The government appealed Saeed's release, appealed against it. They didn't want it to happen. Some politicians and some judges seemed a little critical of this release. So it may be not concerned with all aspects of the Pakistani government, but there is a history of support for Islamists by the military. They saw it as a strategic tool in their struggle with India and broader power projection. And so we do have that continuing. So I would say elements of the administration, maybe some effort by them.
Michael, why does it matter to Hafiz Saeed now? What kind of strings can Pakistan pull at the United Nations? What are his chances, according to you?
Well, as I said before, they're very limited. There's all this talk about how Pakistan has its friend China in the Security Council and how China has tried to help Pakistan when it comes to the case of Masood Azhar, the head of Jaish-e-Mohammed, in terms of getting his name removed as a terrorist, according to the UN. I just see very little chances of success here, and it's quite extraordinary because Hafiz Saeed has hired a private law firm in Lahore to represent him at the UN. And I think this goes to show that, in Pakistan, I think it's important to acknowledge here that he is seen as a perfectly innocent person by many folks, including law firms, that would be willing to take his case to the UN and argue that he's not a terrorist and that he should be taken off the list. But all that said, I think that this is not going to be successful. I think he wants to try to capitalize on the fact that he's now out of house arrest. He wants to try to rehabilitate his image. As I was saying before, this is something that I would argue Lashkar-e-Taiba has been trying to do for quite some time. As you know, just a few months ago, a new religious political party, the Mili Muslim League, was formed. It is a party connected to Lashkar-e-Taiba. This is a party that has started contesting elections, and I think that's part of an effort to try to make LET seem more palatable, to mainstream it, so to speak. And this notion of Hafiz Saeed trying to get his name removed from the terrorist list of the UN, I think it's all part of the same idea, the same objective, to try to get people, whether in Pakistan or elsewhere, to view this person, Saeed, and his organization in a very different light. But again, I don't think it's going to be very successful.
Peter, do you see a role of the Pakistan government here? Does this appeal at the United Nations have Islamabad and, more importantly, Rawalpindi's backing?
It's possible. Like I said, it seemed like the Pakistani government was not completely behind the release, although that might have just been for show. Given America's strong objection to his release and to any kind of delisting, they risk running afoul of America, although our leverage is limited because we've tried to pressure them in the past to cut off support for militants. I can't imagine they would make a concerted push behind this because there's so much diplomatic furor, as others have said. The UN has such legitimacy that challenging them might seem problematic. But we might see some support from certain aspects of the military.
Right. Peter S. Henn and Michael Kugelman, thanks very much. This is just the beginning of this case. We haven't heard the last of it, of course.